and we're going to go back to Brian for status of the Middle Fork and Upper Salmon River rearing habitats. And I did want to say to all the speakers and the audience, George, I got a couple papers, and at lunch, I did have them distributed to the audience. I got your second one here, but I'm going to wait until the end of the day. So if any of the speakers want to distribute any other additional papers to the audience, then send them to me, and I'll send out one more email after the workshop today to get any more reading material that you might want to share with the audience.
All right, what I wanted to do, since I've spent a lot of time in this part of the world and have some familiarity, on the ground familiarity with a few of these valleys, but really pretty good in the air familiarity with all of these valleys. I wanted to do a higher level overview of kind of the condition. So it's, if you will, a bit of a crude condition assessment of rearing habitat in these two major watersheds, the Upper Salmon River and the Middle Fork Salmon River. So I'm going to do that through Google Earth, and that's actually quite an incredible tool for us to use nowadays, because you can look at different photograph time series. You can look at dry years and average years and wet years sometimes, and occasionally we can get photos old enough on Google Earth to see some of the earliest damages, but most often not. The earliest air photos we have on Google Earth are from the 60s or 70s, and most of the big damage was already done by then. But what I'm going to do is I've calibrated my perspective of these green valleys based on the work that Paul did here using the geomorphic grade line in the Pacimmeroy. So we're looking at the lower 2/3 or so of the Pacimmeroy alluvial valley. And Paul's estimate for sort of the wetted functional area is 2.9 million square meters in the current condition. And its potential condition is about 19 million square meters. And I looked at this current air photo, or this most recent available air photo on Google Earth, taken in June, and estimated what I thought would be the functional wetted area in this condition, and came up with just about the exact same answer that Paul did. So it's about 15% of the green valley bottom that has signatures of multiple thread channels, old beaver dams, and looks like it, with a little bit of manipulation, could be, all functional wetted area is about 15%. So I scaled my eye to that, and then looked at a number of other valleys. And so let's just fly over to Smiley Creek. And I hope this is working for you all. Let's stop the zoom before it gets too carried away. So Smiley Creek is it's very close to the far headwaters of the Salmon River. And Ketchum and Sun Valley are over here on the far right-hand bottom part of the screen over Galena Summit. And this is the extent of the Salmon River watershed. And at the very head of the Salmon River watershed are two pretty good-looking valleys, or three pretty good-looking valleys that I've flown through a number of times. And I need to turn those off. Oh, that didn't do it. All right, there it is. So I've turned off that because I did an area measurement on it, and I should have turned it off before we got here. If we zoom into this valley quite a lot before we start to lose details, we can see a lot of water here in July. We see a really wet meadow. We see some beaver dams. We see water in multiple channels, and really a very lush and green valley bottom from valley wall to valley wall. And that's a pretty good performing mountain meadow. There's this geomorphically pinched zone here in the middle where there is a single thread channel because that's all there's geomorphic space for. That looks like that's probably got really good spawning gravel bars on it. And upstream from that is another really wet meadow with even more beaver dams on it and some nice ponded habitat. And it's really wet from valley wall to valley wall. So that one's performing quite well. The only damages to it that I see are probably fewer beaver than it had historically. And there is, I think it probably has been heavily grazed in the past, although I don't believe it is anymore. And overall, it's functioning pretty well, but it's quite small. And I've got a table of these areas that I'll show you at the end so we can kind of put some spatial perspective on this. This next one over to the west is Frenchman Creek, and here's an air photo that I took a few years ago flying down that valley, and it too is in actually quite good condition. You zoom in and you can see this network of water from valley wall to valley wall. There are beaver dams evident, and some wetter and drier sections because of changes in valley width, changes in processes at the downstream end, which is where we commonly see the most persistent wet areas. It's really performing nicely. There's this really great meadow complex at the downstream end of it. And it too is very small, narrow, and geologically confined. If we slide over one more to the west, I think this is Smiley Creek. I hope I got these creek place names right. I believe that this is the headwaters of Smiley Creek. Even though it has a road going up it and is used for camping year-round and hunting access, it's in pretty good condition too, although it has much more of a defined meandering channel. You can see campers there on the left bank, but it's still got water features, evident water habitat across a broad width of this valley, and it's in pretty good shape. Except I think this section down here has very little beaver dam activity, and it seems like it probably has had in the past a lot more beaver activity than it has now. But its very upstream section here is much wetter and is better rearing habitat, and it is supported by a couple of beaver dams in this section right here. So that's Smiley Creek and Frenchman Creek and the Upper Salmon River. And I don't know if these actually are important to salmonids, or if salmonids can get to them because of barrier problems downstream. I actually don't know if they're being utilized, but it looks like they would do a good job of rearing salmon. So let's go down valley now. We'll follow the Salmon River down valley. And I know there's been a lot of work for the last century, even on Pole Creek, and I'm not going to dive into that because I don't know enough about it to really speak to it intelligently. But I will look at a couple of places along the way as we go down valley that look interesting, and I would like to look at myself and get a little bit more familiarity with it and look at its potential. And one of them is this spring complex over here by Pettit Lake. If we zoom in on that, you can see this is the head of a spring complex that is fully charged up with water in July of an average year. And I've actually fished this a couple of times and have pulled a lot of juvenile fish out of it. And but it's got some damage to it. And I don't really know what people were intending to do with this, but here's a ditch that cuts across it, and this ditch actually comes away from the spring source and heads out across this dry land. And without knowing the elevations here, I'm not actually sure which direction that ditch is headed, but there's some kind of drainage scheme going on here. Here's some more ditches, and I don't know if these are hopeful distributaries for doing some irrigation scheme or what they are, but these seem like things that might be worth looking at to see if eradicating them would improve the performance of what is potentially a really important spring creek here at Pettit Lake Springs. And I think this is all forest land, so there's not that private land limitation. So then if we go down Pettit Creek to its confluence now with the Salmon River, actually it's Alturas Creek and its confluence with the Salmon River, we get into the main stem Salmon River, and we see a lot of really nice complex habitat here, multiple channels in this confluence zone, but also the main channels are really quite large and quite simple. They don't have much in the way of flow obstructions in them, and I suspect they've been modified probably in relation to bridge building. This highway's been in the valley for over 100 years, and just general tendencies to clear land and improve drainage that we've seen elsewhere in the world. We also don't see, except for a very rare beaver dam in this whole stretch, and there's copious willows. So that doesn't seem to be entirely right to me. So let me zoom back out some. We'll head further down valley. Now we're going down the main Salmon River here. There's a number of diversions and irrigation schemes along the way that, again, I don't know the status of them to speak to them in any specifics, but you can see where the diverted water is now sent out across this.
Brian,
this
our region,
upland.
I was just going to say, our Region 7 Fish and Game staff is chiming in saying in the 70s there were over 100 Chinook reds in Smiley Creek. Frenchman has also had Chinook reds. In lower escapement years, we have not documented as much spawning that high in the system. That's from the local biologist in the area.
That's excellent input. Thank you. 100 reds is amazing. That far up the system, that's nearly 1,000 miles from Pacific Ocean. Wild. So I see some really interesting and what I think is pretty rich habitat on the main stem here that I'm calling just above Reese Place constriction. Actually may not have this land ownership right, but this is one of the examples I show in other presentations of how even in the dry season, and I have some photographs from the fall here in this location that actually I have one of them over here. You can see all the willows are brown and red. So this is dry season. And you can see these side channels and back channels are all wetted up and really, I think, performing at a really high level for this landscape. And that's right upstream from this geologic constriction here. So these alluvial valley pockets and wet meadow pockets that sort of come and go, turn on and off as you go down the landscape are really an important part of that mosaic of delivering different kinds of habitats under different conditions. Now let's go down valley some more. Here's the hatchery. I don't know if it's a barrier or a partial barrier, but I think maybe there's been some historical concern about fish not being able to get upstream from it. Again, I don't want to say much more about that because my knowledge is pretty limited. The highway 75, if I can figure out which polygon this is and turn it off. There we go. So Highway 75 actually cuts off over half of what was former floodplain, flooded valley setting in this zone right below the hatchery reach. The channel is now quite confined and deep, and only occasionally gets into these side channels. Whereas I think before the highway, it probably was wet from valley wall to valley wall, because this is a major geologic constriction right here at the Redfish Lake moraine. So that portion of the main stem river is not performing nearly as well as it probably has in the past. Although a little inside secret, this is really good fishing in here in the summertime. Then we get to Redfish Lake Creek, which I like to show, especially my West Coast Fish Passage colleagues, because they always worry about stream slopes that are really steep. And this is my favorite example of a slope that they would just pass out over in California. This is 18% slope for about 800 feet, and it's 900 miles from the Pacific Ocean. So fish managed to do this, and they have for millennia. And just upstream from that, just upstream from this constriction, is this really nice stage 0 complex in Redfish Lake Creek that, although it has a lot of infrastructure around it, campground infrastructure, recreational infrastructure, it's because of the strong geologic backwater, it's got really nice habitat that I think performs year round. So let's zoom back out a little bit and go down to Stanley and stop and get a scone at the bakery. And then we'll work our way up Valley Creek and some tributaries to Valley Creek. And so here's Lower Valley Creek now. And let me get that polygon turned off. Whoop, wrong one. There it is. All right, so Lower Valley Creek is a really pretty low gradient, meandering, sometimes multi-threaded stream with tons of infrastructure at its downstream end. You can see multiple homes actually on floodplain elevation. It's a miracle they don't get flooded more often. But I think it really speaks to the flood attenuation that occurs upstream from here in Valley Creek that defends these people who are built right in the floodplain on Lower Valley Creek in Stanley. There is, as you go up Valley Creek, there's lots of remnant off-channel habitats that are disconnected. There are a few channels that are quite deep that remain connected almost year-round. I believe there's one of them here in this old Oxbow area, which is really interesting. I haven't sampled this myself with hook and line, but I suspect that that's a good rearing habitat. It stays wetted, I believe, year-round. Every time I've looked at it, even in the late fall, it's wet. But there's quite a lot of indication of incision on Valley Creek. And that's not too hard to imagine because it's been a pretty hard used grazing habitat in this whole valley for well over 100 years. There's almost no beaver activity. There's remnant beaver activity. When you get out here and go fishing, you can find remnant beaver activity almost everywhere, but I don't think there's a single beaver dam in this lower section. In fact, I know there isn't because I've floated this and had the only obstacles I encountered were a couple of cattle fences across it. There are no beaver dams in Lower Valley Creek. I want to go up to a meadow that I've looked at for several years because I have a cabin down here at the base of the mountain. And so I've got a number of photos in different conditions from Goat Creek Meadow. And I know there's fish in here because I've caught them, juveniles of several species. I haven't talked to any of the local biologists though to see if they think this is important or not. But all of these areas are just, they're just stunningly beautiful. And this whole Upper Salmon River watershed is known for its beauty and wet meadows and wildflowers in those meadows. But there's these dry channels across places like Goat Meadow, which are not as pristine as you would think. And here's my 100-pound dog in one of these channels. That's a pretty high capacity channel that's dry, while the wildflowers are blooming. So this should be wetted in a normal year, and it's not. It's dry. It's the rare year that this photo shows here that has any substantial water from valley wall to valley wall in this meadow. And it doesn't stay wet very long. It's literally only a few weeks. And one reason for that is there are natural levees built up on the banks of, here's the single thread channel going down the middle of the meadow. This is Goat Creek single thread channel. There are natural levees, and I've tried to outline them here with a white line, that are the buildup of sediment for when there is a high flow, a flow that just starts to go over bank. Sediment is dropped out into this really thick willow vegetation on both sides, and it builds a natural levee that's only about 6 inches high. But when this valley is flooded, like it is in this condition, the best place to walk up this valley is right on one of these natural levees right next to the stream bank. So through some natural processes, the channel is disconnected from its floodplain. And I'm pretty concerned about this channel because it's running on, in many places, an exposed base level control of a peat layer. And I don't know how thick it is. I don't think it's very thick, actually, because I see places where it's already been punctured, and there are neck points migrating up this channel, which is further disconnecting this meadow. So I did see a couple years ago, one of these conifers had been taken down by a beaver, but they didn't persist. They didn't build a dam, and it's basically just exporting all of this water right out of the sawtooth to cross the meadow without making the meadow part of the ecosystem and sending it down to Stanley. So here is a picture of Goat Creek at flood flow. It's really uncommon to see water standing in the meadow. So that was not performing up to its potential. If we go further up Valley Creek, got into the Valley Creek, we've got a strange air photo here. Let me see if I can change that. Yeah, that's better. Here's another view of that Valley Creek off-channel habitat from the back side of it. This looks like really nice rearing habitat. I'd like to hear from the locals if they think it's being utilized or not. Then as we head up to Sheep Bridge, a good public access point, here you can see the geologically confined but nicely meandering portion of Valley Creek. And that is the upstream end of Lower Valley Creek, as I've defined it. Is the geologic control for Upper Valley Creek, which is we'll go to next after we take a little detour over to Stanley Creek, where the gold discovery was. And again, there's these great green mountain meadows full of beautiful wildflowers most of the summer long, but they are they're definitely not without their harm. Here's Kelly Creek. You can see a drainage ditch going down Kelly Creek, and this is actually quite deep. It's in places 10 feet deep. I don't know what that was, except maybe a diversion for one of these gold discoveries, and they were trying to do a placer out here. And here is that gold discovery. This may be the original gold discovery in this region by Captain Stanley.
Brian, I just wanted to interject. We've got about 5 minutes left before 4 o'clock, so in case you wanted to get questions.
Good. So you can see how dry this valley is, and it's because this channel is really deep. So this is an incised channel, and I think it has been channelized. You can see how straight it is here, and it's had a lot of human interactions with it that have made it incised. And this whole valley, I think, could be green And whether it's directly accessible to fish, I'm not sure, but it would certainly be feeding Lower Valley Creek. So as we go up Valley Creek, we get into some pretty heavily used private land of grazing land. And even though there's a conservation easement around Valley Creek itself and a nice exclusion fence and some pretty good fishing, the valley itself is relatively dry because the creek rarely gets on it. And we have to go over to Elk Meadow just briefly, although I've showed this a couple times today. But here's what part of it looks like in the summer. So it's knee-deep water, tons of juveniles of multiple species using it. Here's the downstream end of it. It's got beaver dams at the downstream end, and it's I think the best example of a highly functioning mountain meadow. So let's go over to, let's cross the drainage divide here at Blind Summit. And now we're into Marsh Creek, which is a tributary to the Middle Fork Salmon. And let me get this polygon turned off. So Marsh Creek is a really long meadow. It's about 10 miles long. The upper end of it is probably not very good habitat, but this lower end around the Knapp Creek confluence here is really good habitat. And from that Copeland et al. Paper, you remember the graphs, I think Paul showed them too, that this is a stronghold for Chinook. And the condition of the confluence area, so this photograph, you've seen a few versions of it today. This is the stage 0 habitat just downstream from the confluence with Knapp Creek. But just upstream from the confluence, it's all single thread channel. And although it's beautiful and it's close to the surface of the floodplain, it's not at the surface of the floodplain. And I don't think this upper part of Marsh Creek floodplain gets wetted very often. What I think is supporting the large population you're seeing in Marsh Creek for rearing is Knapp Creek. So this little tributary Knapp Creek, and it is little, it's actually got really good beaver complexes on it, good stage 0 conditions, multi-threaded channel, and looks to me like it is probably the reason why we're seeing such high numbers of fish coming out of Marsh Creek is because Knapp Creek is actually functioning very well. Then as you go down Marsh Creek, it's all beautiful, meandering, but mostly disconnected, single thread channel with a floodplain around it that is not very functional except for a couple little locations where there's wet side channels. And I think all of this valley width was historically wetted and functioning in stage 0 conditions. So I've got, I went over to Sulphur Creek and looked at it as well, which I think is a good example. Bear Valley Creek is another one that I want to take a quick look at, and then I'll wrap up. We're going to turn off that polygon there. Okay, so let's zoom into Lower Bear Valley Creek Meadow. Now here's the geologic control for Bear Valley Creek. The river goes into this geologic control canyon here, and this depositional meadow then lies just upstream from that. And it's really, a huge, broad alluvial valley with lots of willows. This photo is from September, October even. Yeah, October. And so when there's water on the landscape in October, you've got a water table that's really close to the surface. This little tributary coming in from the north is keeping its confluence zone wet. But these big oxbows and side channels, for the most part, are dry. And I've walked this a number of times and floated it a few times and fished it. And it just really strikes me that this channel has been incised and is disconnected from its floodplain except for in pretty high events. And there's some bank erosion out here, which really, oddly enough, I found some J hooks in these photographs, and I've seen these while fishing and didn't know what they were. Now I really don't know what they are. How did they even get here? And what are they trying to do? So I'm going to stop the air photo overview there. But first show you, this is a completely burned out watershed in Upper Bear Valley Creek. The only thing green left in this image is the wet valley bottom. So that really speaks to that fire resiliency that Kate was showing us from the South Fork as well. So I've got a little spreadsheet here. I'm not going to put too much stock in these numbers, and you shouldn't either, but it's my first attempt to do kind of a qualitative, semi-qualitative assessment of how big these meadows are and how large that functional area could be, and compare it to what I think the functional area is today. And I did that by, like I said at the beginning, I scaled my eye to Paul's work on the Pacimmeroy using the geomorphic grade line and LIDAR, and then applied that same sort of thinking to these meadows. And so I have their area listed here in column C is in terms of million square meters, and I gave them a score from 0 to 3 for their function. Elk Meadow is the one that I think performs the best, so it got a score of 3. Pacimmeroy gets a score of 1, and that's about 15% of its area is functional, which is what Paul verified. So I applied that to all of these other meadows, and there is, if we exclude Elk Meadow and the Pacimmeroy, there's 19 million square meters of mountain meadow available just in those examples, and only something less than 3 million square meters is functioning well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in these mountain meadows, and with not a lot of intervention, great improvements could be made in rearing habitat area and quality. And I think all but Valley Creek is in federal ownership. So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Brian. It's a little after 4, but we still have quite a few people on. I just wanted to see if there were any questions or if you guys wanted to just do some discussion. Looks like you got invitations into the Upper Salmon watershed sometime with the Fish and Game Region 7 fish crew, Brian.
That'd be great.
That's good.
That'd be great.
You can go get some scones and go fishing.
I see Paul wants to go.
Yeah, Paul wants to go too. So thank you, everyone. We do have time for some questions. I'm going to take the screen just so I can put up everyone's email address right there. While if anyone has any lingering questions or you want to have some conversations, Kate extended the invitation to everyone that wants to come visit one of her tours in Oregon. Her contact information's here. And any other questions?
I've got one. Do we have any local Forest Service folks on this workshop?
I'm going to say yes. We got, I would imagine, I haven't pulled up the whole registration list, but I think a lot of our audience are primary project implementers and fishery biologists and restoration specialists.
Well, I'll put in a quick plug then. Johan and Kate are both on the RATS team, which, you know, they largely work in Oregon and Washington, but it might be possible to get them out that way as well. And also, I'll put in a plug for myself as part of that team, worked with those guys forever. It really is my position. I'm supposed to just help Forest Service offices around the country. So it's already covered off the top. All they got to do is submit a request to my supervisor and say we want help. So if anybody wants me to come out there, that's all you got to do.
That's awesome. And is that only Forest Service employees, or can other people request your time too?
Other people can, but it's got to be through the Forest Service office. You got to coordinate with the local folks there.
Yes, so this is Kate. For example, this project on Fin Rock Reach that we're doing on private land, we actually have Paul coming over to help us for implementation. So it can be done on private land, just has to go through the Forest Service office.
That's an excellent resource. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, and I would just agree with Kate that we're really open to having folks come visit our projects in the middle of the blood and guts. Please do contact us if you're interested in that. And we mentioned there's a stage 8 going on this summer, and then that Paul, Kate, and I are all working on. And concurrently, there's one at Deer Creek, the next phase of Deer Creek. So plenty to look at if folks want to come to the west side of Oregon and take a look.